Ready to dive into some really fascinating territory today. We're tackling gene editing. But, and here's the twist, we're looking at it through an Islamic lens.
It's a really unique perspective, because it brings together cutting-edge science and these age-old ethical traditions.
Exactly. And we've got some great material to dig into articles on Islamic bioethics, plus excerpts from the Quran and Hadith. It's like getting a crash course in what does Islam really say about messing with our DNA.
And what's so interesting about this technology, about gene editing, is that it forces us to really confront those big questions. Like what does creation even mean? What are the limits of healing?
Right. It's like gene editing is holding up a mirror to all our beliefs about life and who we are. And I think there's no better place to start than with a story that really kind of threw this whole debate onto the world stage. The He Jiankui case.
Oh, absolutely.
So for anyone who's not familiar, this scientist, He Jiankui, he used this gene editing tool, CRISPR-Cas9, and he edited the genomes of human embryos.
He did. And his goal was to make them resistant to HIV. But here's the thing. It resulted in the birth of actual babies with altered genes. And it wasn't just a theoretical discussion anymore, it was real.
Yeah, I remember when that story broke. It made a lot of people really uncomfortable.
Rightfully so. Because suddenly those ethical concerns about editing the human germline, the genes we pass down, they weren't hypothetical anymore.
Exactly. So how does Islamic bioethics, with its, centuries-old traditions, approach a technology like this, a cutting-edge technology like gene editing?
So it's not so much about a set of rules with Islamic bioethics. It's more of a framework for making decisions, right? It's about approaching a new medical technology, in this case, gene editing, and asking, how do we use this? How do we use this to preserve life? How do we use it to promote well-being? And most importantly, how do we use this to prevent harm?
Okay, so it's not just a straightforward yes or no on gene editing.
Exactly.
It's about really understanding the nuances.
Yeah, it's about carefully weighing the benefits against the potential downsides.
But how do you actually measure benefit versus harm when you're talking about something as complex as, changing our very DNA?
Well, that's where Islamic legal and moral guidelines come in. These guidelines draw upon the Quran, the Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and, of course, centuries of interpretations by Islamic scholars. And one of the key concepts they use is something called Maqasid al-Sharia.
Okay, Maqasid al-Sharia. Now, that sounds a little intimidating. Can you break that down for us? What does that even mean?
Yeah. It sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. Essentially, it refers to the overarching objectives of Islamic law, which aim to protect 5 core necessities. Think of them as the foundational pillars for a good life, for a just life.
5 necessities. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these 5 necessities.
All right. So these 5 necessities are safeguarding religion, protecting life, preserving intellect, maintaining lineage, and ensuring responsible stewardship of wealth. And each of these necessities, when we're talking about gene editing, each one of these necessities comes into play.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this works. Can you give me an example of how one of these necessities might actually apply to the gene editing debate?
Let's take, for example, the preservation of life. That's a major goal in Islam. If we're talking about using gene editing to prevent a deadly genetic disease, that seems like it aligns with this necessity.
Right. Yeah, it seems like a good thing, preventing suffering, preserving life.
But then you have to ask, well, are we overstepping? Are we interfering with what some might call God's plan?
It's like this ethical balancing act almost, right? Where each of those 5 necessities acts as a weight on each side of the scale.
Exactly. And then, just to make it even more interesting, there's another layer of guidance that comes from Islamic legal maxims, what are called qawaid fiqhiyah.
Qawaid fiqhiyah. Okay, I feel like you're just showing off with the vocabulary now. But in all seriousness, what are those?
So, imagine these as these guiding principles, almost like legal precedents, that help Islamic scholars apply the broader rules of Islam to very specific situations, like, you guessed it, gene editing.
So they're like the ethical cheat sheet for navigating these uncharted waters, so to speak.
You could say that. And they provide this really helpful framework for applying Islamic values to these new dilemmas. So, for instance, one maxim states that acts are judged by their goals and purposes. So when it comes to gene editing, it's not just about the action itself, but it's the intention behind it.
So does that mean if a scientist has good intentions, that automatically makes gene editing okay?
Not necessarily, because another maxim states that harm must be eliminated. So even with the best of intentions, you have to consider the potential risks of gene editing. What if, even if your goal is to help, even if your goal is to prevent suffering, what if there are unintended consequences?
It's about weighing those scales.
Exactly.
Benefit and harm.
It always comes down to that balance, weighing the benefits against the potential harm.
So it sounds like, at least from what we've talked about so far, Islamic bioethics is less about these rigid yes or no answers and more about thoughtfully considering all the angles of a complex issue. Would you say that's true?
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about understanding the potential consequences, understanding the motivations, and constantly asking ourselves, we're overstepping our boundaries. Are we respecting the sanctity of life as it was created?
Which leads us to the big question I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. Is gene editing, especially when we're talking about changing those heritable genes, is that messing with God's creation?
The million-dollar question. And believe me, it's one that's sparked a lot of debate.
And I'm sure we'll get into that.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll save that for after a quick break.
So, where were we? Ah, yes, the million-dollar question. Is gene editing messing with God's creation? Well, there's this verse in the Quran, Al-Rum 30, that often comes up. It talks about God creating mankind in a specific way, and it encourages us to follow that blueprint.
So some people might hear that and think, okay, case closed, no gene editing allowed.
It's not quite that simple. You see, like any religious text, the Quran is open to interpretation, and different scholars, they have different views on what this verse means, especially when it comes to gene editing.
Okay, so walk us through those different viewpoints then. What are the nuances here?
So some scholars argue that while the verse emphasizes the importance of not distorting God's creation, it doesn't necessarily prohibit every single form of alteration. They'd say it's about understanding the context. What's the intention? What's the outcome of the change you're making?
So it's less about a blanket no and more about a case-by-case evaluation.
Exactly. For example, those scholars might say that using gene editing to prevent a debilitating disease, essentially restoring someone to a healthier state, that's different from using it to enhance someone's abilities beyond what's considered normal.
So fixing what's broken versus trying to upgrade to some superhuman level.
Precisely.
I like that analogy.
And, to kind of make this whole concept a little more relatable, Islamic scholars, they often draw a comparison with plastic surgery.
Okay, plastic surgery and gene editing. How do those two connect?
Well, think about it. Reconstructive surgery, like if you're fixing a cleft palate or you're repairing severe burns, that's generally seen as, okay, why? Because the intention is to alleviate suffering, to restore someone, right? But cosmetic surgery done purely for aesthetic reasons, like getting a nose job just because you don't like the shape, that's where things get a little ethically murky.
Again, it's the why behind the change, right? The intention behind it.
Exactly. And that emphasis on intention, on carefully weighing those potential benefits and harms, that's really at the core of Islamic bioethics. It's about constantly asking ourselves, are we honoring the sanctity of life? Are we making choices that align with our values?
So it's about navigating those gray areas.
Oh, absolutely.
Those tough questions where there isn't always a clear-cut answer.
Especially with gene editing, those gray areas are vast. We're talking about the very blueprint of life, So those questions about responsibility, about intention, unintended consequences, those are crucial.
This is already giving me a lot to think about. And we've talked about this idea of changing God's creation.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that there's this whole other layer of ethical decision-making in Islamic thought, right? And we keep coming back to these 5 core necessities, those pillars of, safeguarding religion, life, intellect, lineage, and wealth.
Yeah.
So how do those play a role in actually navigating the complexities of gene editing?
They're essential. It's not enough to just say, well, this verse in the Quran might suggest this. You have to look at the whole picture, So let's say scientists are considering using gene editing to eliminate a hereditary disease. On the surface, that sounds like it aligns with the principle of preserving life.
Right. Yeah. It seems like a good thing. Preventing suffering.
But you then have to consider those other necessities, right?
Okay.
What if that editing technique carries a risk? What if there are unintended consequences? What if it alters other genes and those changes are passed down to future generations, harming their intellect or their lineage? It's not just about the immediate, it's about the long term.
Yeah. So it's about looking beyond the immediate potential benefit to consider those long-term impacts, not just on the individual, but on their family, on future generations.
Exactly. And then you have the question of whether using gene editing for this purpose is even necessary.
Right.
Or are there other less risky options available?
Like maybe there's a way to address the disease through medication or gene therapy that targets specific cells.
Exactly. And that's where another key Islamic concept comes in, maslah.
Maslah. Did you say that means something like public interest? The common good?
You got it. It's about looking beyond just the individual and considering the broader societal implications of our choices, especially when we're talking about matters of life and death, health, well-being.
So in the context of gene editing, how would this concept of maslaha guide decision-making? Can you give us an example of how that would actually work?
Okay, let's imagine that there's a push to use gene editing to eliminate a genetic predisposition for a certain type of cancer. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a no-brainer. Who wouldn't want to eliminate cancer, right?
Right.
But maslaha means we have to dig a little deeper.
Okay, what kind of questions would we ask if we're thinking about it through that lens?
Well, we'd ask, how widespread is this genetic predisposition? What's the likelihood of someone with this predisposition actually developing cancer? Are there lifestyle changes, medical treatments that can mitigate the risk? And importantly, what are the potential downsides of gene editing in this case?
So it's not just about can we do it, it's should we do it?
Exactly. And are those resources being poured into this gene editing research, are they better spent on something else? Like developing affordable treatments for cancers that are already affecting millions.
Right, so it ultimately ties back to those 5 core necessities.
Exactly.
Like responsible stewardship of resources.
Maslaha is like this ethical compass helping us navigate these murky waters and make sure that our decisions are not only scientifically sound, but ethically responsible.
So it's not just about what we can do with gene editing, it's about what we should do.
You said it. And maslaha, it gives us this framework. It allows us to have those tough conversations and make sure that, as we advance scientifically, we're also advancing ethically.
I like that. It's about making sure those two things go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed by all these layers of Islamic law and ethical principles. I mean, how do scholars actually use all of this in real-world decision-making?
It's true. It can seem like a lot, but think of it like building a house. You've got your foundation, right? Your Quran and Hadith. And then you've got the walls and the roof, and those are your 5 necessities and your legal maxim, like maslaha. They provide the structure,
I like that analogy. So how does this ethical house actually get built when it comes to gene editing? Like, what are the steps involved?
Well, Islamic scholars would typically start by looking at what type of gene editing is being proposed. Are we talking about germline editing? Are we changing that DNA that's passed down through generations? Or is it somatic cell editing, where it targets specific cells in the body?
Oh, okay.
That's a crucial distinction.
So the type of gene editing matters.
Absolutely. Then they'd consider the purpose. Is it therapeutic to prevent disease? Or is it enhancement to boost certain traits?
Right, because we talked about those. Those are 2 very different things.
Very different. And of course, they'd assess the benefits and the harms, not just for the individual, but for their family, for society as a whole. Remember, maslaha.
Maslaha, right. That common good.
That public interest is key. They'd also consider how much certainty, how much uncertainty there is surrounding the gene editing technique.
What do you mean by that?
Well, some gene editing techniques, they're very precise. Others carry a higher risk of what we call off-target effects.
Could you explain off-target effects? I have a feeling some of our listeners might be wondering about that too.
Of course. Imagine you have a pair of scissors and you're trying to cut a specific piece of paper. Off-target effects are like accidentally snipping something else nearby, something you didn't intend to cut. With gene editing, that means you might accidentally alter the wrong part of the DNA.
And that could have consequences we don't even know about, right?
Exactly, unpredictable consequences. And Islamic scholars would take that level of precision into account when making a judgment. They would also look for guidance from previous rulings, like on similar issues like permissibility of medical treatments, reproductive technologies, things like that.
So looking for precedents for how Islamic principles have been applied to other ethical dilemmas.
It's not about reinventing the wheel every time, right? It's about looking to the wisdom, centuries of wisdom and tradition.
So much to consider. And I imagine there's situations where, even with all these guidelines, there's still some disagreement.
Oh, absolutely. Islamic bioethics isn't about imposing one single rigid interpretation. It's about having these open and honest discussions, acknowledging the complexity, and always striving to make choices that align with those overarching values of Islam, compassion, justice, preserving life.
It's a process.
It is.
An ongoing dialogue.
And that's what makes it so relevant.
Yeah.
Especially now.
Especially as technology keeps advancing.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating how Islamic bioethics really dives into these complex issues with so much nuance. And, we've been talking about gene editing, but what about existing technologies like IVF or PGD? Those are already shaping how we think about family planning. So how do those fit into this ethical framework?
You're right. Those are great examples of Islamic bioethics in action. Take IVF, for example. It can be an amazing option for couples who are struggling to conceive naturally, but it also brings up these questions about lineage, which is one of those 5 necessities we keep coming back to.
Right, because IVF sometimes involves using donor sperm or donor eggs.
Right.
Right. So how does that work with the Islamic emphasis on maintaining that clear lineage within a family?
That's where the debate gets really interesting. You see, most Islamic scholars say IVF is only really okay when the sperm and the egg come directly from the husband and wife and the fertilized egg is implanted in the wife's womb. That way there's no question about the child's biological parents.
It keeps that direct biological connection intact. But IVF often involves creating multiple embryos, right? So what happens to the ones that aren't implanted? That seems like another ethical tightrope to walk.
Oh, it definitely is. And it leads us right to the complexities of PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. With PGD, doctors can actually screen those embryos for certain genetic conditions before implantation.
So parents could potentially choose an embryo that doesn't carry a gene for serious inherited disease.
Exactly. But here's where things get even more complex from an Islamic perspective. There's a lot of discussion about the moral status of an embryo. When does an embryo actually become a person? Now, most scholars would agree that a fetus has full moral status after 120 days. That's the point of ensoulment. But the rulings on embryos before that point, those are less clear-cut.
So if there's some uncertainty about an embryo's moral status before 120 days, does that mean procedures like PGD, which sometimes involve discarding embryos with certain genes, does that make them more likely to be okay?
That's a huge question in the debate. Some scholars might say intervening at such an early stage is okay, especially if it prevents suffering. But others would argue that even the potential for life, even at that early stage, deserves protection. And this is where gene editing really kind of throws a wrench into things.
Because with gene editing, we're not just talking about selecting an embryo, we're talking about making changes that will be passed down to future generations.
Exactly. And that brings up a whole other level of responsibility. It's not just impacting one person. It could impact an entire lineage. And that raises all sorts of questions about consent, about unintended consequences down the line. Do we even have the right to make those kinds of decisions for future generations who haven't even been born yet?
Yeah, it's like the butterfly effect, right? Even a small change to the germline could have huge ripple effects way, way down the line.
Exactly. And then when you add in the uncertainty about the long-term effects of gene editing, plus the potential for those off-target edits, that strong belief that the benefit outweighs the harm, that Ghalabat al-Zan, that becomes even more crucial.
And all those Islamic legal maxims we talked about, those guiding principles, they become even more relevant.
Absolutely. Like that idea that harm must be eliminated.
Right.
And don't forget about masalaha. Thinking about the well-being of society as a whole. Gene editing might seem like a solution for one family, but could it lead to even greater inequality down the line? Could it have these huge unintended consequences for the human gene pool? These are the big picture questions that Islamic bioethics forces us to confront.
It's a really humbling thought, isn't it? To recognize that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves, both in time and in scope.
I think so. And that's why it's so crucial to have this ongoing dialogue, not just between, scientists and ethicists, but religious scholars, the public, everyone. There are no easy answers, that's for sure. But by having these open and honest discussions, by considering all these different viewpoints, we can hopefully make responsible choices that benefit all of humanity, not just a select few.
So as we kind of wade into these uncharted waters of gene editing, Islamic bioethics gives us not just a set of rules, but a framework for making ethical decisions. It encourages us to ask those tough questions, to think about the broader implications of what we're doing, and to always remember that the pursuit of knowledge should go hand in hand with a deep respect for life and for the future.
I think that's beautifully put. It's about finding that balance between pushing the boundaries of what we can do and staying true to those values that guide us.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive for today. We hope you found this exploration insightful, maybe even a little challenging. But as always, we encourage you to keep asking those big questions, keep searching for those aha moments, and keep diving deep.